Okay, so picture this. You're watching a colony of ants,
Mm.
right? And it's like they're all working together perfectly, like flawlessly. Each ant has a job, they're contributing to the colony, even the ones who never reproduce.
Mm.
It's like you almost think there's some grand plan, some intelligent designer making sure everything runs smoothly. But that's not how evolution works, is it?
Not quite.
So today, we're diving into the concept of agency in evolution, how scientists apply this idea to make sense of adaptation. We're working with excerpts from Samir Okasha's book, Agents and Goals in Evolution.
Okay.
And this is going to help you understand how organisms can seem so well designed for their environments without, actually having an intentional plan.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating way to look at it. I mean,
Mm.
we tend to see purpose in nature,
Mm.
but evolution achieves these outcomes without, a conscious director.
Right. It's not like evolution's sitting there with a blueprint.
Right.
So how do scientists explain this apparent purposefulness?
So Okasha calls it agential thinking,
Okay.
and he actually breaks it down into two types.
Two types. Okay, I'm all ears.
Yeah. So the first type is pretty intuitive.
Mm.
It's where we talk about organisms as if they have goals,
Okay.
like saying a spider wants to catch a fly. Obviously, the spider isn't consciously plotting,
Right.
but it's a helpful way to think about its behavior.
Yeah.
You see how this kind of language helps us understand the purpose of a spider's web, even though the spider isn't consciously planning.
It's like we're saying, hey, this adaptation serves this function, even if the organism didn't sit down and decide to evolve it. What's the second type of agential thinking?
This is where things get a little trickier. Type 2 is about thinking of natural selection itself as an agent,
Okay.
like Mother Nature is actively trying to perfect a species.
But doesn't that kind of thinking lead us down a dangerous path? I mean, evolution isn't really trying to do anything, is it?
Exactly. Evolution has no predetermined goal or direction. It's important to remember that.
So even though we can talk about organisms as if they have goals,
Mm.
we have to be careful not to project that onto evolution itself. But hold on. If organisms aren't consciously choosing their adaptations, why even talk about them as agents with goals in the first place?
It comes down to the fact that an organism's behavior and traits often make the most sense when we think about their function. They seem goal-directed, even if it's not conscious.
Okay, I see what you mean. Like a plant growing toward the sun. It's not making a conscious choice,
Right.
but it achieves the goal of getting more sunlight.
Exactly. Plus, organisms show amazing flexibility. They change their behavior in response to their environment. And then there are the adaptations themselves.
Right.
Those features that make an organism perfectly suited for its environment. Definitely look designed with a purpose. Okasha even quotes another biologist, Roth, who talks about an organism's decision about when to reproduce.
Wow, so scientists themselves use this language of agency.
They do.
But you mentioned earlier that there's a catch, right?
There is. It's the unity of purpose constraint.
Okay.
We can only think of an organism as an agent if all of its traits are working together toward a common goal.
So if there's conflict within the organism, the whole agent metaphor kind of falls apart.
Exactly. Think of it like this. We usually assume a person is acting rationally if their actions match their goals.
Right.
But what if different parts of their mind are pulling them in different directions?
Okay.
It becomes harder to say what their true goal is, right?
It's like that saying, one step forward, two steps back.
Right.
So what could cause that kind of internal conflict in an organism?
Okasha brings up selfish genetic elements. Those bits of DNA that act in their own self-interest. Sometimes they even harm the organism.
Wow.
Okasha quotes Burt and Travers, who describe genes disagreeing about what's best for the organism. One gene might push for a male to produce lots of healthy sperm, while another might try to sabotage half the sperm to give itself an advantage. This shows you how even at the most basic level, evolution isn't always about what's best for the organism. Sometimes it's a battle of the genes.
Wow, that's mind-blowing. So even at the genetic level, there can be a lack of unity that messes with the organism's goal of surviving and reproducing. It's like having a team where not everyone is playing for the same side.
That's a great analogy. And this is where the idea of genes themselves as agents comes in.
Hold on, how can genes be agents? They don't have brains, do they?
It's not about consciousness.
Mm.
Think of it as a useful way to understand certain genetic phenomena. Dawkins, with his selfish gene concept, wasn't saying genes are little people.
Right. It's a way to understand how genes spread through populations.
Exactly. It helps explain things like meiotic drive. That's when a gene manipulates cell division to improve its own odds of getting passed on, even if it hurts the organism's chances of survival. Basically, the gene is acting in its own self-interest.
So even though it sounds a little strange, sometimes we need to think about genes as having goals to understand how they work. But how does this relate back to the idea of the organism as an agent?
Well, when genes are cooperating, working together to boost the organism's fitness, then we can think of the organism itself as the agent. It's as if the genes have teamed up and the organism is their vehicle to achieve a common goal.
So that unity of purpose is back and the organism can function as a cohesive unit.
Precisely. Now, Okasha does get into the nitty-gritty here, talking about how we can mathematically represent a gene's goal in terms of how it wants to be included in as many viable offspring as possible.
I'm glad someone can formalize it, but it does show how even at this tiny scale, the concept of goals can be a useful tool.
It is. And it sets us up to think about agency at even higher levels. Think groups,
Yeah.
like those ant colonies we were talking about.
Okay, now we're talking. Are you saying that a whole group can act as a single agent with a goal?
Sometimes, yes. It's especially compelling in cases of eusocial insects, like ants and bees, where you see incredible cooperation and even sterile individuals sacrificing their own reproduction for the colony.
That's exactly what made me think of the intelligent designer idea in the first place. It really does look like a group level adaptation, but I have a feeling you're going to tell me there are challenges to thinking of even these colonies as true agents.
You're catching on. And you're right, just like within organisms, you can have conflict within a group that messes with that unity of purpose.
So even a perfectly organized ant colony might have some internal drama going on. What would that look like?
Okasha gives a great example. Melipona bees. They have incredible defense mechanisms, with bees willing to die defending their hive. Seems like a clear case of group adaptation, right?
Makes total sense to me.
But here's the thing. These bees make way more queens than they need, and the worker bees kill off the extras. It's a waste of resources for the colony as a whole.
So it's like individual bees are acting selfishly even if it hurts the colony?
Exactly. Even in extremely cooperative groups, there can be conflict that makes it tough to apply this agential thinking.
It sounds like whether we can consider a group an agent depends on how well individual interests are aligned. Just like with those genes within an organism.
You got it. And this connects to understanding human societies, too. How do we get individuals with their own desires and goals to cooperate for the common good?
That's a question for the ages. And it sounds like nature has found some pretty clever solutions even at the level of genes and cells. But I'm thinking maybe that's a topic for a whole other deep dive.
You're probably right about that. There's a lot more to uncover in Okasha's book. But let's shift gears now and explore another big idea in evolutionary biology: fitness maximization. Is it always the driving force we think it is?
Ooh, I'm sensing a bit of controversy brewing. I'm ready if you are. So we've been looking at how thinking about groups as agents can be helpful for understanding evolution. But what about this idea that evolution always leads to the best possible outcome? Like everything is always being optimized for maximum fitness? Is that really how it works?
But what's fascinating is that this assumption that natural selection always maximizes fitness is more complicated than it appears at first glance.
Wait a minute, isn't survival of the fittest? The idea that the best adapted ones win out? Like evolution 101.
Well, that's the simplified version. In reality, there are all kinds of factors that can prevent a population from reaching that theoretical peak fitness.
Okay, I'm listening. What kind of factors could get in the way of evolution optimizing things?
Well, for one thing, fitness can be what we call frequency dependent. The advantage of a trait might depend on how common it is in the population.
So a trait that's super beneficial when it's rare might actually become a disadvantage if everyone starts having it.
Exactly. And then you have to consider that environments are constantly changing. So evolution is like trying to hit a moving target.
Okay.
What's optimal today might not be optimal tomorrow.
So it's not just about climbing to the highest peak. It's like that peak is shifting all the time.
That's a great way to put it.
Hmm.
And on top of that, you have genetic constraints.
Yeah.
An organism's evolutionary potential is limited by the genes it already has. It's not like evolution can just design anything from scratch.
So even if the perfect adaptation exists in theory, the organism might not have the genetic tools to get there.
Right. And Okasha points to a couple of famous ideas in evolutionary biology that, while insightful, don't fully support this idea of natural selection as a perfect optimizer. One is Wright's adaptive landscape.
That's the one with the peaks and valleys representing fitness levels, right? And populations are always trying to climb to the highest peak.
Yes. The other is Fisher's fundamental theorem of natural selection.
Okay, that one sounds familiar, but I need a refresher.
Basically, It says that the rate a population's average fitness increases is tied to the amount of variation in fitness within that population.
So more variation means faster adaptation.
In a very simplified sense, yes. But as Okasha points out, while valuable, these ideas don't necessarily prove that natural selection is this all-powerful optimizer.
So evolution might be messier and less goal-oriented than we often assume.
Precisely. And this challenges the misconception that evolution is all about progress towards some ideal state of perfection.
It's more about constantly adapting to a changing world, with no fixed endpoint. It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It does. And this brings us to a really interesting concept from Okasha's book, The Veil of Ignorance.
Okay, now that rings a bell. Isn't that a philosophical idea?
It is. It's usually used to think about fairness in society. Like, how do you design a fair system if you don't know what position you'll end up in? But Okasha applies this to biology as well.
So are you saying that ants and bees are pondering ethical dilemmas?
Not exactly.
Yeah.
It's about how a lack of information can actually encourage cooperation.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued. How does that work?
Think about those ant queens Okasha mentions. When they start a new colony, they cooperate to raise the first workers. But later on, they fight to the death until only one queen remains.
So it's in their best interest to cooperate at first, even though they'll become rivals later on?
Yes, but if a queen knew for sure that she was going to lose that fight, she'd never cooperate in the first place.
Right, she'd be better off going solo. So this veil of ignorance, not knowing their future, is actually what makes cooperation possible.
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, but it's an elegant solution that evolution has come up with. And Okasha highlights how this idea applies within organisms as well.
Now I'm really curious, how does a veil of ignorance work inside an organism?
Think about genetic recombination, the shuffling of genes that occurs during sexual reproduction.
Right, that's why siblings aren't identical clones.
Precisely. And it creates a kind of information suppression from the gene's perspective. When a gene is passed on, it doesn't know what other genes it'll end up paired with in the next generation.
So a gene can't manipulate things to guarantee its own survival because it doesn't know who its future partners will be.
Exactly. This forces genes to cooperate, because their best strategy is to contribute to the overall success of the organism.
So not having all the information actually leads to a stronger unity of purpose. That's amazing.
It is. Nature has these remarkable ways of resolving conflict and promoting cooperation, even at the most basic levels of life.
So we've been talking about how evolution isn't always about maximizing fitness in this straightforward way, and how a lack of information can sometimes lead to greater cooperation. But what about this idea of the organism as a rational agent? How does that fit with all this complexity?
That's a great question. And there's some really interesting instances where the logic of rational choice and the logic of evolution seem to diverge.
Okay, this is where I always feel like I'm about to venture into uncharted territory, but I'm ready for it. Hit me with it.
Well, Okasha dedicates a whole chapter to what he calls parting of ways examples.
Okay.
These are situations where an organism's behavior, even if it's been optimized by natural selection, might not line up with what we'd expect from a perfectly rational agent.
So natural selection can produce behaviors that seem, well, irrational.
From a certain perspective, yes.
Yeah.
Would you like to explore some specific examples?
Absolutely. The more specific, the better. It helps me grasp these abstract concepts.
All right, let's start with the ultimatum game. It's a classic experiment in behavioral economics.
Ooh, I think I've heard of this one. Doesn't it involve splitting money?
It does. Imagine two players. One is the proposer, who decides how to split a sum of money. The other is the responder, who can either accept the offer or reject it. If they reject it, no one gets any money.
So there's an incentive to accept any offer even if it's unfair. Right. Otherwise, you both lose.
From a purely rational, self-interested viewpoint, that's true. But what we see in reality is that people often reject unfair offers.
So they'd rather get nothing than accept something they see as unjust. You know, I can totally relate to that. I remember this one time.
It's a common reaction,
Yeah.
and it seems irrational from a traditional economic perspective. But Okasha suggests this sense of fairness, even if it seems irrational, could have evolutionary roots.
So maybe in our evolutionary past, being seen as someone who just accepts any deal no matter how unfair was actually a bad thing for your survival or your reputation.
That's a possibility. And Okasha offers some more intriguing examples of where rational choice and evolutionary logic seem to go their separate ways.
Okay, lay it on me. What else do you have?
Well, there's this concept called intransitive preferences. It's a bit of a mouthful.
It means something like, if you prefer A to B and B to C, then you must prefer A to C.
Right?
The logic of transitivity.
Exactly. But Okasha describes a study where researchers modeled an animal's foraging behavior And they discovered that depending on the animal's energy reserves, it might make choices that seem to violate this principle of transitivity.
Wait, that seems counterintuitive. How could that possibly be adaptive?
It all comes down to the complex trade-offs organisms face in the real world. In this model, the animal is trying to maximize its chances of surviving the winter, balancing the need for food with the risk of getting eaten by a predator.
So the best choice might change depending on how hungry the animal is and how dangerous its environment is at that moment.
Exactly. This can lead to preferences that appear irrational on the surface, where what's best in one situation might not be best in another.
So even though it looks irrational at first glance, it's actually a finely tuned adaptation to the animal's specific ecological circumstances.
Precisely. And it demonstrates how those simple textbook models of rational choice can sometimes break down when we consider the complexities of evolution.
Okay, give me one more of these parting of ways examples. I'm enjoying having my assumptions challenged.
How about risk preferences?
You mean how an organism responds to uncertainty? Like, does it prefer a sure thing or a riskier option with a potentially bigger payoff?
Exactly. Traditional economic theory suggests that rational agents will always go for the option with the highest expected value, even if it involves risk.
But are you saying evolution might favor a different approach?
Sometimes, yes.
No.
And again, it depends on the complexities of the environment. For example, if an organism is in a really harsh environment where any mistake could be deadly,
It would probably be better to play it safe, even if that means a smaller potential reward.
right? Evolution might favor being risk-averse in those situations, but if the environment is more forgiving,
Then taking a gamble might be the best strategy.
exactly.
Yeah.
And Okasha shows how this can result in outcomes that seem irrational from a purely economic standpoint.
It's like evolution is a master strategist, constantly adjusting its game plan based on the challenges of the environment.
That's a great way to think about it. And it reminds us that concepts like rationality and optimality are actually quite nuanced when we're talking about the living world.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground today. We've discussed the limitations of agential thinking, the challenges to the idea that fitness is always maximized, and how the logic of rational choice can sometimes clash with the logic of evolution. I need a moment to process all this.
It is a lot to take in. But before we wrap up, I think we should touch on one last idea from Okasha's book, the concept of progress and evolution. If evolution isn't always about maximizing fitness, what does that tell us about the nature of progress in the biological world?
That's a great question, and it kind of brings us full circle to our very first example, that sense of design we see in nature, particularly in those intricate ant colonies. What does all of this tell us about how we understand progress in evolution?
Well, if we step back and look at the bigger picture, it really challenges this common idea of evolution as constant progress towards some ultimate goal.
So it's not like a ladder steadily climbing upward, more like a tree branching out in all directions with lots of twists and turns along the way.
That's an excellent analogy. And the amazing thing is, sometimes those seemingly less optimal choices, those detours, might actually be what leads to even greater adaptation in the long run.
So maybe taking a step back could set up a bigger leap forward later on, or exploring a seemingly less ideal path could unlock new possibilities.
Exactly. Evolution is full of surprises. It reminds us to question our assumptions about progress and embrace the unpredictable and often brilliant creativity of the evolutionary process.
I love that. It's like a reminder to stay curious and open-minded. Always be ready for those unexpected twists and turns.
Precisely. And I think that's a great point to leave our listeners with today.
Yeah, this has been a truly mind-bending deep dive into the concept of agency and goals in evolution. We've seen how this way of thinking can be a powerful tool for understanding adaptation, but it definitely has its limitations.
It has. And we've explored how some of those common assumptions about evolution, like the idea that it always leads to perfection or perfectly rational choices, might not be the whole story.
Evolution is more intricate, more creative, and honestly much more interesting than that. So what does all this mean for our listeners? Why should they care about this idea of agency in evolution?
Well, for one, it helps us grasp the incredible diversity and complexity of life on Earth. Those seemingly designed features, those amazing adaptations we see in organisms, they don't come from some grand plan. They emerge from this blind yet incredibly powerful process of natural selection.
It's like appreciating a work of art, not just for its beauty, but understanding the techniques and the process that the artist used to create it.
That's a perfect analogy. Understanding agency and evolution helps us avoid falling into the trap of thinking about evolution as just a straight line of progress towards some ultimate goal.
Right. It's more about trade-offs, compromises, and those unexpected turns we were talking about.
Exactly. And lastly, I think it encourages us to be a bit more humble about our place in the natural world. We humans, with our conscious goals and rational thinking, are just one outcome of this long, ongoing evolutionary process.
A process that's still unfolding, still full of so much potential and mystery.
Indeed. And who knows what astonishing adaptations, what seemingly irrational yet brilliant strategies evolution will come up with next.
I, for one, can't wait to find out. And for our listeners who want to explore this topic further, I highly recommend checking out Samir Okasha's book, Agents and Goals in Evolution. It's a fascinating read that challenges our assumptions and deepens our understanding of the living world.
I completely agree. It's a must-read for anyone who wants to go beyond the simplified explanations and really grapple with the complexities of evolution.